So what I want to do today is talk to you not about a very formal type of strategic planning. I want to talk to you about the type of planning my organization takes in the work that we do. And I'm really actually excited to do this, and so very grateful for this opportunity, because IECBC is an organization that works with the business community in British Columbia, not just Vancouver, to connect them to skilled immigrants. And we mostly get to talk about what talent immigrants bring and why business needs to adjust their thinking, or I shouldn't say their thinking, their hiring practices. But I don't often get to talk about how we plan out what we do, how we make this all make sense when we're trying to accomplish a great deal. And I'm just going to put my timer on here to make sure that I don't go over time. So what I'm going to focus on today is what I think are the key elements and lessons learned from the planning that we've undertaken and the partnerships. And I love some of the pieces that Mayor just spoke to about the critical components of those multi-stakeholder partnerships in our work, and some of the promising practices that have come out of that, and also the principles that continue to guide that ongoing planning and engagement, because I think those are some of the very important pieces. So again, sorry folks at the back, looking at British Columbia, we know that of course the majority of immigrants land and stay in Metro Vancouver. Interestingly enough, what I'm going to speak about is some of the work we've done in planning and implementation outside of Metro Vancouver, which I think may be of some interest. So very quickly, who are we? We were established in 2009 not to duplicate the work that the settlement agencies across British Columbia were doing, but to fill a small gap. And that gap being that in our province, the majority of employers are small and medium sized with limited HR capacity, and they needed support and help to be able to better attract and retain. That's a critical piece, retaining immigrants in their workforce. So our mandate is to strictly work with the business community. Now, we knew three things from the outset. We knew that our scope and reach had to be provincial, not easy when you're a small organization based in Metro Vancouver. We knew that we needed to focus, again, the work with business, with industry associations and chambers of commerce, etc. We did that because in order to get to scope and scale on our work, those partners were going to be critical. And we also knew that we had to continue to engage policymakers on an ongoing basis as to why immigrant unemployment and underemployment remained an issue, and why we needed to get the demand side more engaged and build their capacity. So today, our focus is threefold. We continue to work to ensure that employers understand that we're now in a demand-driven immigration system, what that means and how they need to get further involved, to work with smaller communities across BC, and to work through partnerships. Frankly, none of what we do IECBC does alone, and so all our planning and implementation, and hopefully at the end of some of these processes, walking away from the table to allow partners to continue the work. So very quickly, we started in 2009. In 2011, we started on a very clear, progressive planning process. And we realized that we needed to be evidence-based. We needed to get the groundwork that we could then use to present to funders, to our board, and partners and stakeholders such as employers as to what the actual picture of immigrant employment looked like in BC, but from an employer's eyes. What were they saying? What were they thinking? What were they doing? So we went around the province. We spoke to more than 150 employers directly. We did focus groups. We were in 7 communities. We did 8 industry sectors because they corresponded with our BC jobs plan. And when I say we did that, we did none of it alone. All of the outreach, all of the identification of the right people to be at the table was done through our partners. And in this case, it was the business organizations in individual communities throughout BC. Now, how did we get them engaged? You know, it wasn't that hard. In many places there is an understanding of labor shortage needs, that demographics are changing, that employers are struggling to find people within communities, and the business organizations often have within their mandate the intention to try and support their members around developing their HR capacity. So we knew that in most cases they were our natural allies. So we learned a lot through the consultation, and that formed the basis of our planning process. Where did we go from there? And just on a very high level, you know, we knew the challenges employers face, but we got more evidence. We heard more firsthand what they needed. We had a better understanding of sort of the overall employment picture in British Columbia. Where were there some real needs? And where there was that need, was there appetite to do something about it? And I think that's one of the critical pieces, because we have also found that if you don't find the right champions, those right partners, nothing moves ahead, regardless of whether or not the numbers tell you that it should. We got a really clear understanding of the HR practices and workplace culture that impacts immigrants being hired and being retained. And we also, at the end of the day, felt that we had engaged some key partners around the province that we continue to work with to this day. And so that was, for us, one of the outcomes that we were driving for, is to identify who would continue to do this work going into the future. These were not meant to be one-time only sort of planning and identification sessions. So we learned some promising practice, and we took from this what we wanted to do in going forward. There were some key areas in British Columbia at the time that self-identified as, we want to work with you, we need to understand how we can attract and retain immigrants in our community. And can you work with us to develop some planning processes for our cities? And I've identified them here. Sorry, folks at the back of the room. I'm only going to speak to one today. One example, which is the city down there in the northeast, the city of Prince George. From the consultation, this city agreed to hold, the next step was to hold a more in-depth community consultation. So within their community, within their folks, with the people that they thought needed to be there to both to influence and to learn. And this was primarily focusing on the business community, but as we all know, these things are not done in isolation. So post-secondary was there. There's a strong immigrant serving organization in Prince George was at the table, as well as a number of other key stakeholders. But again, the drive has always been, how do you get the business community to the table? The way to do that was to have the business organizations bring them to the table. We talk about leading from behind, and that's really one of IACBC's roles. So this forum was held in partnership with the Prince George Chamber of Commerce and Initiatives Prince George, which is their economic development organization. The goal of the day was very simple, to come up with 2 to 3 actions for that community that they could lead and implement after this session. And I'm happy to say that in this case, and it isn't always the case, they actually did manage to drill down to a couple of things that as a community they felt that they could do. And I'm going to speak to you now about how they moved those actions forward as part of their own overall planning process to build capacity within their community. So this was the day of the discussion. Sorry, these are just pretty pictures of people talking for those of you at the back of the room. They developed 2 initiatives. Oh, and before I go into this, I forgot to mention something, and so forgive me. One of the things that was critical in the development of the forum and in ensuring who was at the table was recognizing what else was being done in the community and what the issues were. So for example, in Prince George, there's high Aboriginal unemployment. So how do you go into a community where there's high Aboriginal unemployment and say you should be attracting and hiring immigrants? It was a really interesting conundrum for us, and how we approached that was, first of all, we had an advisory group that was made up of those business folks primarily leading the development of the forum, but they engaged the Aboriginal community. They were folks that we had them involved in the day, we had them involved in the planning process. So I didn't want to neglect that piece, that you need to pay attention to those issues, and also again to what else anybody else is doing that you don't want to try to reinvent or to duplicate. So outcomes from that planning that the community then moved forward with. Two specifically that I want to speak to. They said that they needed to, again, try and hire more people. That was critical. And then I'm going to talk to you about how they knew they had to have people be able to live in that community. But so on the higher end of things, they developed an online job fair. They targeted the Lower Mainland because they knew that there may be unemployed or underemployed immigrants in the Lower Mainland. And they reached out through us, through our connections, through immigrant serving organizations in Vancouver and the outlying areas. So those organizations were key in helping to publicize this to their clients and make sure that there were people aware that there was these opportunities and that this career fair was happening. We were out of it at this point, aside from providing some support. This was truly led by the Economic Development Organization at this time. They took the ownership for it. So again, for us, that goal was met in terms of the community taking the leadership on one of the actions that came out of the planning session. Then the second thing they did was say, you know what, it isn't enough to have people come and work here. We understand the issues around living. And so they did a number of small pieces, but to promote that, to publicize their city, they came up with a campaign that they called Consider Prince George. And it was a website and a social media campaign. And embedded within that, they talked about how they talked about the schools in Prince George, and they talked about the ability to connect with your religious group. And they talked about the pieces that they as a community had identified might be barriers to people coming and living within their community. And again, the leadership here was not only the business organizations, but also the City of Prince George, who really had it now embedded in their strategic plan that attracting people to the region, and immigrants were one of the key groups that they wanted to try to attract, was critical. So I'm getting the high sign here. Don't worry, I'm almost done. So these are just two of the highlights, but for us, again, through that planning process of starting with the consultation, moving through to identifying a specific community, and I've only talked to one, working with them to help them develop a plan and actions that they could implement, was really ultimately our goal. I guess what I'd like to say in summary, or just to repeat a few of the things that I've mentioned here, from the beginning, that gathering that data and evidence at the beginning is critical. And it's critical because it is how you get, I guess, the buy-in that ultimately you need to move forward. Engaging your partners in a meaningful way is also key. And I know everyone in this room knows that. But what I sometimes see is that you need to define what meaningful is for them, not meaningful for you. And until you can do that, frankly, it's not meaningful. You can say you have as many advisory groups or focus sessions or whatever as you want, and it doesn't really matter. And identifying those short-term achievable outcomes also matters, because planning is great and people do want to be engaged, but they also want to see something happen. And I would encourage you all that as you look at planning multi-stakeholder partnerships, that you chunk off those little pieces that make people feel like they've had a win, you know, that they're actually doing something that makes a difference. And with that, I'm going to say thank you very much.